I'm going to hand this over to Jen Ward from Pro West and Associates. Pro West is our keynote sponsor for this morning. So Jen, would you like to introduce Clinton, our keynote?
Yes, thank you, Katie. So good morning, everybody. I'm Jen Ward with Pro West, as Katie said, and we're very happy to be a conference sponsor here this year. And I get the pleasure of introducing you to our keynote speaker this morning, Clinton Johnson. Clinton leads ESRI's Racial Equity and Social Justice team, and he also founded and leads the NorthStar of GIS, a community organization that focuses on racial justice and works to advocate equity and belonging for Black, African, Disparia, and GIS. Clinton advocates for justice, representation, and belonging for Black people and other from underrepresented groups in GIS and STEM more broadly. Clinton takes an empathetic approach to technology, beginning with real-world challenges faced by diverse communities and finding a creative way to implement practical solutions. And so with that, I am very excited to introduce you to Clinton Johnson. And Clinton, take it away.
Thanks, Jen. I think when you stop sharing, I'll share.
Yep, I will stop sharing and you should have control.
Appreciate it. So for a second here, you're stuck with looking at me twice. Sorry about that. Hey everybody, as Jen said, and Katie said as well, my name is Clinton Johnson and I use he, him pronouns. And I lead Esri's Racial Equity and Social Justice team, helping our users leverage GIS to advance racial equity and social justice. And I'm also the founder of a community organization. Dang, that's twice you're looking at the same person. Sorry about that. I also am the founder and leader of the community organization, a nonprofit called the NorthStar of GIS. Since 2017, we've delivered engaging events and workshops for over 2,000 guests, showcasing dozens of Black students and professionals sharing innovative solutions for business and social impact. We also offer anti-racism and belonging content and services to help leaders, educators, and everyday people advance intersectional anti-racism and increase belonging for Black people and other marginalized groups. And I'm excited to be here with you today, bringing my full self as an employee of the global leader in GIS and as a grassroots GIS community leader, here to talk about this very important topic, intersectional racial justice in GIS. Our broader industry, the tech industry, is at the center of changes happening in our world that are basically revolutionary. And geography and GIS are a huge part of those changes. Citizens and companies can create their own channels to communicate their concerns and their interests. Technology can essentially follow you anywhere to entertain you and to empower you. Real things in our real world are tracking and communicating their status and our status in real time. Technology itself is being taught to learn and to adapt to real world challenges. And maps are the most consistent aspect of these transformations, maps and data. And that means that each of you is a part of these dynamic changes. Some of you make maps to perform analysis to help businesses find the best locations to pursue commercial interests. Some help governments use GIS to better allocate public resources. Some help community organizations use GIS to support policy change and optimize interventions to increase opportunities for all. And some use GIS to educate future generations of practitioners who will join all of you in changing the world. And all of you right now are participating in this effort within this community to develop and support the GIS professional in Minnesota for the benefit of Minnesota and its citizens. And what does that really mean? Who is the GIS professional in Minnesota? Who are the citizens of Minnesota? And how can and should the citizens benefit from the GIS professional? And what does all of this have to do with racial justice? Let's start with racial justice. Racial injustices place higher burdens on some individuals, families, and communities than others, ultimately reducing the collective capacity of every city, of every county, of every region, and ultimately of every country. like racial disparities in home ownership rates in Minnesota that consequently impact the ability of people from each racial group, their ability to grow and sustain wealth that affords opportunities in education and opportunities in entrepreneurial pursuits. Now let's use these flowers and the situation that they find themselves in to talk about racial inequity. I'm sure that you've all seen many of these diagrams before. And and the ones I'll share today, some of you have probably seen these as well. They were created by a group called ECOS. ECOS works to drive environmental stewardship and inspire communities to foster a sustainable future. So what they're depicting here as flowers, I want all of you to think about as individuals, as families, or communities from different racial groups situated somewhere in society, some city, some county, some state, perhaps Minnesota. And you can think of the ground that the pots are standing on as the foundation that those that came before them were able to provide. And you can think of the fence posts between the flowers and the sun as barriers that we all face of varying kinds and varying levels. You can think of the sun itself as opportunity or resources that contribute to health, to education, economic and social outcomes. And frankly, each flower is not getting the same amount of access to the sun. And over time, their health and condition will suffer in varying ways as a consequence. So someone has decided here to be fair and to provide the same resources to each flower. But ultimately, this approach wasn't fair. It generally isn't fair. In fact, in this situation, it shows how this kind of approach to equally distributing resources can increase disparities. You see, some flowers are getting more sun than others. And there's one flower or community that still isn't getting access to the sun at all. So some policies try to provide the same resources to everyone, every person, every family, every neighborhood, but really a nuanced approach is needed to account for the different barriers that people face. So to be more fair, organizations are trying to provide resources that align with needs. They want to create policies that allocate resources to communities based upon the different barriers they face. What they say is that they want to try to provide resources in accordance with needs, where the needs are greatest. So for instance, policies that and the decisions that we all make related to our management of the pandemic must be racially equitable to address the racial disparities in COVID-19 and to address health equity more broadly. As you can see in this example, from a story map called Segregation is Killing Us by Territorial Empathy in New York, the wealthier white neighborhoods in New York City were less impacted by the pandemic, while on the other hand, low-income communities of color were devastated by the disease. At one point, neighborhoods like Corona, Queens were global hotspots. And in one neighborhood, over 4,500 people were infected and 395 people died just during phase 1. But let's break down racial equity a little bit more. There are generally 3 answers to the question, what is racial equity? Racial equity is a condition, one that is met when policies, practices, attitudes, and messages no longer produce racial inequities. Racial equity is also a process, the work done to address racial inequities, and both the condition and the process requires analysis, some assessment or root cause analysis of racial inequities. And the overall goal is to achieve the condition of racial equity by doing the work in the process of racial equity, all of which is informed and validated by racial equity analysis. And that's really where you all come in. And true fairness in this context would be racial justice, the removal of all barriers that prevent equity for members of different racial groups. And many organizations are trying to identify policies that present barriers for some in order to make adjustments to ensure more justice for all. Now, who are Minnesotans? And as I was telling the event organizers, I've never been to Minnesota. And I was definitely looking forward to being there in person with all of you. And since I've never been there and I've met few Minnesotans, for the sake of simplicity and to remain really focused on racial justice, we'll explore the racial demographics of Minnesota. Looking at the state as a whole, about 76% of people chose white alone in the US Census in 2020. About 7% chose Black or African American alone. About 1% chose American Indian or Alaskan Native alone. 5.2% chose Asian alone, almost the national average of 5.9%. 0.1% chose Native Hawaiian alone, and 6.1% of all the population declared that they were of Hispanic, Latin American, or Spanish origins. Now, when we look at Hennepin County, which includes the historically redlined Minneapolis, the Black or African American alone population is almost double that of the state and is above the national average, and is about there, the national average actually. The white alone population is a bit less than the state at 65.6%. And the Asian alone and folks identifying as being Hispanic, Latin American, or Spanish in origins increased a bit. Looking at Ramsey County, the numbers shift a bit more. The percentage of people identifying as white alone is a little bit lower at 58%. The percentage of the population identifying as Asian alone is double that of Hennepin and 3 times that of the state. And the percentage of the population identifying as being Hispanic, Latin American, or Spanish in origins is up to 8.2%. So therefore, who is the Minnesotan GIS professional, or who should they be? Well, in a racially just Minnesota, the GIS professional would reflect the communities that they work in, the communities that they serve. So across the state, about 6.1% would identify as being of Hispanic, Latin American, or Spanish origins. In Hennepin County, about 13% would identify as Black or African American. And in Ramsey County, about 16% would identify as Asian. Now, what benefits does the Minnesotan GIS professional provide to Minnesota and its citizens? Again, in a racially just Minnesota, the GIS professional's most significant contribution to citizens would arguably be providing geospatial capabilities that advance anti-racism at the intersections of all systems of oppression. And I'm here with you virtually today to talk about how all of you who see yourselves as GIS professionals and those who support the success of GIS professionals, how all of you can do just that. How GIS professionals can create maps, perform spatial analysis, and collect and share data to create more equitable outcomes for the citizens of Minnesota and others, as well as how we can focus inward on the GIS profession to increase racial equity and belonging for all. So today, first I'm going to talk to you about how you can use GIS to advance intersectional racial justice. Then I'll talk about applying that lens inward to make the GIS profession itself a more just and equitable space where people from underrepresented groups can all find belonging. And finally, I'll share some pro-equity, anti-racist steps that you can start taking today. Now, maybe I made that sound easy. And in some ways, for talented professionals like yourselves, making maps and performing analysis with a few additional data elements or attributes probably would seem like just another day at the office. However, the data elements we're talking about are social characteristics that help provide insight into complex and overlapping issues like racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, caste, and so much more. So there will be times when you struggle to find data that really reflects the racial, gender, and other social identities that you're trying to account for. You'll struggle to find your way through the complex landscape of terminology, and you'll struggle to find the best words to use to describe your work. So yes, this will be challenging. Yet few other challenges can have comparable impacts on the lives and livelihoods of Minnesotans and others around the world. So take on these challenges for the benefit of your fellow citizens and future generations of Minnesotans. Take them on for your fellow GIS professionals from underrepresented groups. And just take on these challenges because it's the right thing to do. And Esri provides comprehensive GIS and location intelligence resources to support a broad range of racial equity and social justice initiatives. And in many ways, these resources really just reflect the emerging and positive practices for advancing racial equity and social justice that leaders working in and around your organizations have been executing and evolving for years. And we will absolutely continue to evolve this guidance and our capabilities as your needs and your efforts to address racial equity also evolve. So let's focus on the first part of the framework, which helps address one of the most compelling challenges of our time: how to apply a comprehensive racial equity and social justice lens to understand and address disparities in how people of different complex social identities experience communities and experience outcomes. So equity work is rarely about race alone. Racialized identities consist of all of these factors. Certainly, race, ethnicity, these are important, but as are caste, tribe, indigeneity, religion, language, immigration status, country of origin. All of those factors have often been used to racialize groups of people and used by systems and communities to create different outcomes for folks. But those base level racialized identities aren't enough to really understand the full breadth of inequity. You've got to look at other social characteristics like gender, sexual orientation, age, and ability. And all of these also intersect together along with things that we think of as socioeconomic class, like home ownership, highest level of educational attainment, and so many other factors. And all of these come together and intersect with location to give us a more rich, robust understanding of how people may be experiencing outcomes a bit differently from the norm or from each other in terms of these intersectional racial identity groups. And GIS is the perfect, ideal platform to bring together all of this data and complexity into one system to help folks find that perhaps across all of these intersectional identities, that maybe it's the Black boys between 6 and 10 in low-income communities in North Philadelphia, and Latinas in their 20s and living in high-income communities also in other parts of North Philadelphia, and perhaps white men in their early 30s living in low-income communities in South and Northeast Philadelphia, who are all experiencing comparable differences, disparities from the norm, from everyone else. So we also recognize that we need to apply these lenses to how people experience community. So we promote a racial equity and social justice streams concept, a racial equity and social justice root cause analysis methodology that I'll walk through really quickly. And in this model, outcomes are the indicators of how people fare. That is to say, how individuals, families, and communities fare socially, economically, in terms of education, health, and other factors. And outcomes include things like educational attainment, school attrition, prevalence and severity of chronic disease, and many other social, health, educational, and many other results. Community assets and conditions are the circumstances surrounding individuals, families, and communities, where they live, where they work, where they play, where they travel, where they commute. And community conditions include circumstances like access to quality healthcare, to education, to parks, to specific recreational resources. the conditions in terms of housing or the environment, the quality of air, water, and soil, and many other conditions across a wide range of concerns. Now, decisions and practices, well, these are the policies, programs, systems, messaging, and budget decisions that influence the circumstances surrounding individuals, families, and communities, ultimately impacting how they fare. These include historic and contemporary practices and decisions by governments, businesses, other institutions, and by communities themselves. So the goal is to identify those decisions and practices that create or sustain structural racism or other forms of discrimination, biased against or for people based on class, gender, or other social groupings, inequitable distributions of resources or power, or intergenerational inequities, meaning any combination of the above impacting multiple generations of families and communities over time. And this model helps us to understand the root causes of social inequities, including racial injustice. So I'll apply this model to an example here. So taking a look at St. Louis, Missouri, where families and communities face a history of discrimination based on race, immigration status, and other social identities due to policies like racial covenants and redlining. And redlining and segregation has been linked to temperatures in neighborhoods. This map here aligns an analysis of temperatures on a particularly hot day in the summer of 2019 with HOLC grades from historic redlining policies. And the bluer areas on this map are cooler, while the areas that are more red, those indicate areas that were more warm. So if we can, let's focus in on this grade A area. Looking closely, we see that this area that was graded A or best was one of the coolest areas in St. Louis at the time. These cooler temperatures have been linked to high tree coverage and vegetation. On the other hand, this area that was graded D or hazardous is one of the warmest areas at the time. And that, of course, was linked to lower tree coverage and less vegetation, as well as to high proportions of paved surfaces. This disparity in temperatures leads to, while it may seem trivial, it leads to things like higher energy bills, negative impacts on chronic health conditions, and higher preterm births. And according to the CDC, urban heat islands have a deadly impact on cities like St. Louis, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and more. And the number of heat wave days has been increasing in many cities across the country. And heat islands and heat waves have also been correlated to increases in hospitalizations for cardiovascular, kidney, and respiratory diseases. Moreover, these extreme events are expected to increase in frequency and intensity in the US for decades to come. And the CDC says that some of the deaths associated with these heat related illnesses include heat stroke, respiratory disease, and more. So we can see how this model of root cause analysis or racial equity and social justice streams can be applied to deconstruct the problem, to help explore more issues such that when organizations may initially just be focused on the heat itself or the lack of access to trees or the prevalence of paved surfaces, sometimes just inherently understanding that there are issues connected with those disparities. This methodology helps organizations to really identify above and beyond just one of the things that they're focusing on, what else may be related, what other outcomes may be related to an outcome that you're focused on, or what other community assets and conditions may be contributing to those outcomes. And ultimately, what decisions and practices can influence the right set of community conditions and circumstances to ultimately affect change in outcomes. So while the goal here is to help us to identify unhealthy streams, in part that is the goal, ultimately what we want to help organizations do is to inform the design of truly healthy streams, to develop and promote those anti-racist practices, to make more pro-equity decisions, to do more to redistribute resources and power, and to undo the harm of intergenerational inequities. And Esri provides a wide range of data and tools to help folks to really look at the intersections of all of these social characteristics through American Community Survey data, your own data, CDC data, so many sources, new data that you collect to understand how people that may be experiencing communities differently and ultimately outcomes differently, all sort of due to decisions and practices further upstream. The next significant component of this framework is racial equity and social justice workflow. The racial equity and social justice workflow is a critical aspect of applying GIS as a framework for equity and social justice. This workflow was derived from emerging and positive practices for advancing racial equity and social justice. And we've simply infused those standard methods with best practices for GIS and location intelligence. Engaged communities is at the core of this workflow to support your efforts to engage citizens, community leaders, and organizations, and other key stakeholders at every stage of the process. Now, racial equity work typically begins with mapping and analyzing equity, meaning identifying populations of concern, the inequities and barriers that they face, and identifying opportunities to increase equity. Next, organizations seek to operationalize racial justice or operationalize racial equity best practices, meaning they want to embed racial equity directly into their institutional and organizational practices to augment their planning and operations for more equitable outcomes. They're using maps and spatial analysis to better allocate resources to increase racial equity for all. Finally, folks seek to manage performance for more equitable results, building on their understanding of where inequities are and layering in the work that they are doing to improve outcomes. Organizations use maps, dashboards, and analysis to find opportunities to alter strategies and operations to increase equity. So leveraging the ArcGIS system, you can map and understand racial inequities in your communities. You can operationalize racial justice by infusing equity directly into your workflows. You also have the ability to assess the impact of your efforts on the community, and you can engage community all along the way using story maps that put your solutions and the work that you're doing in context with the racial inequities that you're trying to address. And you can use surveys to connect with community members, community leaders, and organizers to align your understanding of your operational performance and your plans with the sentiments and realities of the communities that you're trying to support. The next major component is the racial equity and social justice configurations. So we recognize that leaders across the globe are challenged with addressing racial equity in the work that's happening across their organizations. They need tools and resources at their fingertips to inform decisions and actions to ensure that their work is creating benefits for marginalized communities and eliminating burdens. So we're delivering solutions that align with your organization's workflows, as well as product configuration guidance to help GIS teams put together the right piece parts of the ArcGIS system at the right time to support leaders' efforts to advance racial equity in your organizations. So today we have available 3 ArcGIS solutions that I'll just describe briefly. There's a foundational tool that's called the Racial Equity Community Outreach Solution, and that gives you a starting point for a single source of information about equity initiatives that are going on in your area, and you can focus on initiatives and key metrics to drive folks towards the information products that they need to understand where things stand and to make a difference in their work. That solution also comes with a couple of dashboards that help you to apply an equity lens inward to your organization. You can look at the representation on your board, among your staff, among leaders in different levels within your organizations. This stuff really represents the next generation of diversity and inclusion reporting that really looks beyond diversity towards representation. And in a bit later, I'll talk a little bit about the difference between diversity, diverse, and representation. Another solution here is the police transparency solution to help all of those policing agencies that are trying to do better in terms of being transparent and engage with community. It enables folks to share key metrics around some of the activities that are critical to police operations and community engagement between police and the folks who they serve. And then there's a business inclusion solution for organizations that are trying to stand up programs that recognize that systemic and structural barriers make it more difficult for people from marginalized identities, particularly from marginalized racial groups at the intersection of gender and sexual orientation and veteran status, and disability status as well. So for those organizations that are trying to put together programming to support folks who are facing so many disparities to advance their entrepreneurial efforts, or perhaps you are putting together a program within the context of your nonprofit organization to provide different levels of support or discount to people based on marginalized identities. You can also promote those businesses and share their employment opportunities and share their stories and their journeys and share the locations of those businesses with folks within your community. Coming soon, and I wish I had some visuals for this, will be a new ArcGIS solution that'll be released later this year that will help folks to apply and to begin doing some social equity analysis within Pro. So with this tool, you can answer a few really important questions. If your organization is focused on a specific set of populations in the context of racial equity, perhaps you've recognized that Black women, Latinas, and Asian women are experiencing certain disparities, and you want to sort of focus in on where those communities exist. You want to find them. So you can use this solution to find those communities and how they're distributed across the geography. Suppose you've identified a few specific kinds of community concerns that you want to zero in on. You want to understand how benefits and burdens are distributed across your community. Well, you can use geospatial data to create indicators and pull them together into an index that helps you to see how benefits or burdens are distributed across your geography. And perhaps you want to intersect those two things. You've got a set of populations that you're focused on around a set of very specific concerns, and you want to bring those two together to find where people from specific social groups are experiencing specific kinds of issues, and you want to see to what degree they are experiencing them. You can use this tool to find those locations and build an index of what those communities are, how they're distributed, and how their needs or their opportunities are distributed. And then finally, there's a capability of that solution that'll allow you to take a set of potential locations and identify the best locations to deploy resources to meet the needs of those communities that you've identified. So moving forward, the next piece here is the racial equity and social justice envisioning. So we understand that many leaders in all sectors, including a growing list of racial equity leaders, are working to organize and oversee racial equity initiatives and drive impact across the enterprise. So we're making available resources to facilitate the understanding of priorities, impact, and scope in a structured manner to create geospatial strategies that help leaders orchestrate the delivery of geospatial capabilities to drive racial equity throughout your communities. You may be familiar with a concept called racial equity action plans. The racial justice leaders across the country have come up with pretty consistent methodologies for how organizations can begin to apply an equity lenses to their operations and really ultimately to operationalize racial justice. But we've tailored we've pulled together those best practices with best practices for enterprise architecture, for GIS architecture, for solution architecture, to provide guidance that'll help you build a roadmap of geospatial information products and capabilities that align with your roadmap of your equity action plan. So hopefully you can see that GIS is a comprehensive location intelligence, framework to help you to tackle racial equity and social justice initiatives of all kinds across any kind of organization. And in many ways, again, these just reflect your best practices and the best practices of experts, and we'll keep evolving them. So now I'll talk about applying that equity lens inward, to look at GIS as a field, to look at GIS where you work, and to make the profession itself a more just and equitable space where everyone experiences belonging. So I'll talk about the NorthStar guides, and the name and the tagline kind of are on the nose. So NorthStar guides positive practices for advancing intersectional racial justice, equity, and belonging. The idea is to share guidance about foundational concepts, to guide understanding of barriers and provide strategies. So NorthStar Guides provides foundational concepts to pull together all of the commonly shared terms and concepts related to justice, equity, belonging, inclusion, and diversity, to describe barriers to justice, equity, and belonging, and to explore strategies for overcoming those barriers and leveraging those foundational concepts to maximize your impact. Using NorthStar guides, it can really help you to increase equitable representation in your teams. It can help you in your efforts to ground truth your data and analysis, and ultimately help you to optimize racial equity in your work. These guides are designed to augment and support other racial equity and social justice practices, just like the materials that Esri is sharing. They help you to discuss and assess inequities at the intersections of all systems of oppression. They help you to apply root cause analysis approaches like racial equity and social justice streams. And they also, of course, help GIS professionals engage in more nuanced conversations as they work to use GIS to operationalize racial justice. So I'll explore just a few key concepts described in NorthStar guides, because they're really important for all of you to understand the work that you're about to embark on as you're providing this benefit to Minnesotans. I'll talk about social identity a little bit, stereotyping and racialization a little bit. I'm sure you've all heard a bit about these, so I won't take a lot of time. And I'll talk about diversity and representation. So social identity is a concept that comes into play when we interact with each other and when we encounter systems and organizations, when we encounter processes, when we encounter services. Social identity comes into play for us as individuals, and it comes into play for those systems, processes, and services. Social identities are not always simple, like man, woman, white person, Asian person, architect, engineer. These are, of course, social identities, but social identities are intersectional. And we have many of them, and not all of them do we get to create for ourselves. For instance, I sometimes think of myself as a technologist or a Black technologist. However, it's often very relevant to me that I'm a Black man from Philadelphia working in IT or in GIS. Moreover, when people see each other, they often subconsciously or consciously consider their own social characteristics in relation to those of the social characteristics of the folks that they are perceiving from other people. Rarely is there a conversation about who another person is and who you are. More often, subconsciously, we're just sort of taking a swag at who we think someone is. So sometimes when people see me, they may simplistically see me as a Black man or an African American. And often, regardless of my actual age, people may see me as a young Black man. And I'm certain that each of you have your own sense of who you are and the groups that you belong to. And I'm sure that you've likely been misidentified by others. So really quickly, I'll talk about stereotyping and racialization. What are these processes? What do they have in common? What's the difference? And what are the implications for racial justice? I'm sure many of you have taken your company's justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or JEDI trainings, so I won't spend a lot of time here. NorthStar guides really are here to augment what you've learned from other materials to help you apply JEDI-related concepts specifically towards intersectional racial justice, equity, and belonging. So stereotyping is a social process that results in stereotypes and the implications of stereotypes to people, right? And the application of stereotypes to people. So when engaging in stereotypes, you are consciously or unconsciously associating value and behavior to people, to yourself and to others, based on their or your social characteristics. Racialization, on the other hand, results in racial groups. And historically and contemporarily, racialization has stratified people into different levels of humanity. In some cases, identifying some as less human and therefore less worthy of resources or opportunity. Redlining racialized people based on their proximity to Blackness or Africanness, based on their immigration status. Were they European folks who were in the US for many generations, or were they first or second generation immigrants, regardless of which country they were from, including different countries in Europe? It also racialized people in a sense according to their some other social identities, like people being Jewish or people being of Hispanic, Latin American, or quote unquote Mexican origin. And while these processes are both simplistic, they assign behaviors, they assign value. Racialization stratifies humanity and decides that some are subhuman. And so the work that you do as GIS professionals will always, anytime people are in the scope of your work, the historic and present day implications of racism within and across Minnesota and other spaces is present, whether or not you assess or analyze for it. So it's important to do so, to really pull in an understanding of people's various racial identities, particularly as you understand past or contemporary decisions and practices that have racialized folks differently. It's also important that in your work, you really ensure that you're embracing and sharing the humanity of all of those people who are represented simply through data in the scope of your work. So story maps are really helpful in pulling in historical and social context to really contextualize what's happening with folks in places and who people really are. Now I'll just talk a little bit about diversity, just to give you a tip. Diverse asks, is there a difference? And you apply diverse as a concept to groups and to teams. It's not great to apply diverse to individuals. Essentially, diverse itself means other, different. So when you are calling a person diverse, you may inadvertently be referring to that person as other. So apply diverse to groups, not to individuals. And diversity is a little bit different and asks, how diverse is a group? And absolutely, use social identity and definitely intersect a variety of social characteristics. In this particular case, I'm intersecting gender and race. So when we look at this group of people, at a glance and through the data, it may look like, if you just look at gender, it may look like, oh, well, there's 13 men and there are 13 women. Assume that I know these people. And that could feel really great. It could feel like gender equity, but there are no non-binary people represented. And then as we break things down along the lines of race and gender, we can see that among the white population within this group of people, the men are overrepresented in relation to the women in terms of white men and white women. And there's also a bit of overrepresentation among BIPOC folks more broadly, or Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And there's a little disparity in terms of folks in the Black or African American group, and also this is a small set of people. Now, when we're talking about representation, well, this question, representation, asks, does the group reflect a community? This is when you want to take a group, apply diversity to it, and then ask, how does this group compare to another group, a group that is a community of some kind? Maybe the community is educated people within a region. Maybe the community is just all of the people within a region. Maybe it's all of the adults within a region. So in this case, and again, use social identity, intersect social characteristics, and more important than perhaps most of these other things, but equally as important as all of the other things, is to assess locally. So when we look at this group of people and we assess at the national level, things look, maybe pretty good, right? Black women in this staff are 7.7%. In the US, they're 7.6%. That's pretty close. Black men are underrepresented, maybe about half. White men are about equitably, represented. Things look pretty good. But imagine that this is a group of people working in Philadelphia, where 22.2% of the population are Black women. Well, now Black women are underrepresented by more than half. And Black men make up 21.4% of the population. So they're underrepresented by 82%. And white men represent 22% of the population, and now they're overrepresented by almost 75%. So so definitely use these terms appropriately. Don't call a person diverse. Don't refer to a person as diverse or diverse people. Diverse people would mean that there's a group of people who are diverse. There's some difference there, and assess representation locally. So the NorthStar Guide's primers, they describe some of these basic concepts like social identity. We all have them. They're intersectional. Some of the social identities we have, we choose for ourselves, and some are identified by systems and other people. We're also choosing identities for other people, consciously or subconsciously. Stereotyping and racialization is simplistic. It assigns value and behavior to folks. It dehumanizes folks. And so in our analysis of equity, we need to make sure that we are humanizing people through data, through story, through narrative, through visualizations. And we need to account for the reality that in the past, prior to the map that we are making, systems operating in relation to the work that you're doing may have assigned value and behavior to folks that has impacted their outcomes. So when you think about putting this stuff into practice, definitely continue to find ways to apply GIS as a framework for racial equity and social justice. Create intersectional racial equity lenses that are derived from rich and robust data. Leverage the equity streams concept to really understand how one issue is likely connected to many others, ultimately pathing your way towards the decisions and practices that need to be changed through policy work or augmented or accounted for in some way through interventions, and engage communities intersectionally, right? Make sure that when you're engaging communities that that your data that you captured in terms of your surveys of how people feel about your plans or what they agree with about your data, make sure that you're assessing the representation of the folks who are contributing information. Use guidance like the NorthStar Guides for Positive Practices and make sure that you're using positive practices and not simply best practices. There are many quote unquote best practices that are just things that people have been doing for a while that maybe create, in some cases, some incremental good, but may in other cases create some harm, like not disaggregating data. Sometimes people think that a good practice is to aggregate every quote unquote non-white racial group to one group that they may think of as communities of color or non-white population. But this misses some nuances, like the reality that the white category in the US Census includes folks who are Middle Eastern. It includes folks who are North African. And it also just misses the nuances that different systems of oppression are intersectional. They overlap in different ways. They impact people in different ways. So Black or African American folks who are from the US for many generations versus those who are more recent immigrants to the country are experiencing barriers of anti-Black racism in different ways. Likewise, folks who are immigrants from other countries are experiencing these barriers in different ways. Asian communities are racialized and attacked by systems outside of your own in different ways. So you've got to break down these groups at the very least along the lines of race categories, some of the race subcategories, and intersections with ethnicity, and when you can use data about sex, gender, sexual orientation to go further. And then what can you do when you add all this together, when you combine this stuff? So I'll talk about some of the pro-equity and anti-racist steps that you can start to take today. So we want you to reach out to Esri and other leaders who can help you use GIS to advance racial equity and social justice. And I'll talk about some of the resources that are available. And we want you to tap into community organizations that have been advancing racial justice for a long time and tap into each other. So you can get started by visiting esri.com/racial-equity to start to understand how other organizations are using GIS to advance racial equity and social justice around very specific topics. You can find resources to help you begin to map and understand racial disparities and to operationalize racial justice and to manage performance. And you can absolutely find some examples of how folks have engaged with community all along the way. Use the ArcGIS platform. If you're a developer and you're supporting developers, encouraging them to use the ArcGIS platform could help you to help them to embed all of the rich capabilities that the ArcGIS system has to offer as it relates to racial equity and social justice directly into the other systems and platforms that they're using. It'd be great to see business systems across Minnesota, government systems across Minnesota, embedding equity lenses directly into those business systems that people are using every day to decide who should or shouldn't get permits, or how to respond when there's an outage of some kind, and how to plan for the future iterations of development projects across your city. And definitely tap into learn.arcgis.com and the educational services resources that you have as a customer of Esri, and you're going to find an ever-growing list of lessons and trainings that'll help you to tackle a wide range of racial equity and social justice challenges across all of your organization's work. And when you combine these concepts that I talked about today, you can really start to apply them today. Sometimes during conferences like this, virtually, we'll toss out a poll and ask and start to ask some questions to determine whether or not the group of folks who are in the conference itself, in the session itself, equitably represent the community more broadly, right? So that becomes sort of a call to action for some information to inform this call to action for what can you do and who's missing. Definitely, as you're thinking about either who's missing from the GIS community, from your meetings at work, from the teams that you're building, all across Minnesota, apply the equity stream concepts to think about not just external communities that folks live in, but the communities that we work in, right? As spaces that provide circumstances and conditions that are perhaps supportive to some, but create barriers for others. So think about how you can apply those same equity stream concepts internally to the employee communities within your organizations. And reach out to the NorthStar of GIS for more positive practices for advancing anti-racism and belonging at the intersections of other social systems of oppression. And I really don't mean to make all this stuff sound easy. There's going to be days when you feel like your work is completely in vain. You're going to feel like there's nothing you can do, or that there are so many obstacles in your way that you're just going to get tired or saddened, and you'll feel like giving up. In those moments, lean on the consortium and your peers, right? Like, find other folks who are working to confront racism in their work. Build a network of people that you can connect with for validation, healing, and to share strategies to overcome barriers. Try to find time, even brief moments in your day, to re-energize, to continue this important work. And fortunately, there are also experts in racial equity and social justice all around us. Racial justice leaders and champions and organizations that have worked diligently for decades, creating and sharing methodologies and interventions all around the country. We need you in this work. Your Black and Brown colleagues and their communities need you to help reduce barriers. They need you to help make every map, every spatial analysis a tool for increased equity and justice. Your colleagues and others who are seeking to be good allies, they also need you by their sides. And I'm sure the Minnesota GIS, LIS Consortium, Esri, and the NorthStar GIS are all here to help you to plan, design, and create a more equitable future. So thanks everyone for showing up today, and thanks to the organizers of this event for allowing me some space to share some of what I think is important to all of the GIS community with the GIS community here in Minnesota. There's another slide that has some resources on it. I'm just gonna show it here because it's being recorded, and folks can look at this later. And we'll also share some other links in the chat if you have questions.
Thank you very much, Clinton. That was a great presentation. We have a few minutes here. I will open it up to our attendees. If you have any questions, please put those in the Q&A box and we'll answer them now. You are getting lots of applause and thank yous in the chat.
I see. I really appreciate that. Thank you. I see one question I'm trying to grab.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on encouraging diverse students and GIS professionals? Yeah,
definitely. Now, for one thing, coming from, another person from underrepresented groups, from an underrepresented group, it's easier to say something like this or for it to be heard, but we really need these folks in this work. I think GIS is one of these, GIS and geography are these spaces that people just don't realize how much they impact the worlds that we live in. And the challenge, the challenges that many of us face in our communities, or that our families have faced in community for so long, can be alleviated, if more of us are bringing our breadth of lived experience to the work. We all bring who we are in every way that you can define who you are to our work. We combine all of our lived experience with our expertise when we come up with new ways of solving new challenges. So let folks know that we need their new, fresh ideas. We need their full, authentic selves and their perspectives in all of this work, so that we can make the world better. And then also, it's just fun, right? Like, all of you know how fun it is to be a GIS professional, to take on this really exciting work, to see all of the growth and change in technology and how all of it comes together in different ways under the umbrella of GIS and geography.
Yeah, we have a couple other questions here in the chat that I don't want to lose. Does Esri offer professional services to assist organizations in this racial equity work?
Absolutely. We have a growing body of professional services resources that are taking on this racial equity and social justice work across the country. So definitely reach out if you have needs. You can use your credits for that. It's a great way to get started, to learn more about how to take on some of this stuff yourselves, or to just offload the work, right? So you all can continue to focus on the things that you need to do.
All right. When is that ArcGIS Pro tool that you mentioned coming out?
It is coming out. It should be out by December.
By when?
Maybe out December.
December. Okay, great.
Now I'll have to strangle somebody if it doesn't. No, I'm just kidding.
Another question here. What is the most powerful geospatial analysis technique you've seen applied to reveal and address racial and social inequities?
I'll tell you, honestly, some of the simple stuff is really compelling. Sometimes we get caught up in trying to do something really sophisticated, but if you can take if there's a metric, whatever that metric is, maybe in the utility space, it's about the performance of the utility network, or the rate at which people have outages recovered. Perhaps it's just understanding the level of risk that people experience in communities. If you can find a metric that's associated with a geography, you can then associate that geography with the populations that are in that geography. And then behind the scenes, like before you even get to a map, I've seen folks use Python to take that rich data about what's going on in all the tracks across a county to determine, across a county where the greatest disparities are along the lines of race, ethnicity, or gender, and really to light up those counties that are experiencing the greatest disparities. So some of the straightforward stuff is really great. But also, I've seen folks use, and I can't wait until there's some public views of this, but I've seen folks look at the impact of the change in where vaccination locations are positioned in communities in terms of the rates at which different race groups are getting vaccinations across the state, and looking at that spatially, temporally. So that stuff's really exciting too. And I've been talking to some folks in Philadelphia who want to look at the social impact of racial justice focused organizations through augmented reality. So I'm excited to see some of this stuff so that they can stand in their office and look through the walls at the communities to see where folks have needs and where those needs are being addressed by their programming. So there's lots of really interesting things that folks are doing.
We did have another question about the recording. This session is being recorded. How we are going to share it, we have not quite decided yet as a consortium. Possibly on our YouTube channel, but Shauna, I will get back to you on that. And we also had a mention here of, the University of Minnesota did a Mapping Prejudice Project, and the link for that is in the chat for you to check out as well.
Shout out to Edge, great partners of NorthStar. Where NorthStar is hyper-focused on folks in the Black or African diaspora across GIS, geography, and beyond. Edge is a network of networks that is pulling in together resources and opportunities for people from underrepresented groups, underrepresented racial and ethnic groups more broadly.
Okay, we have another question here. Clinton, have you been able to get involved in the K-12 ArcGIS online map competitions?
I have not as yet, and I wanted to. I told myself last year that we would get involved for this upcoming year. If folks are interested and they want to help us, whether through Esri or through the NorthStar of GIS, do things like host a map competition for K-12 students focused on Black History Month, like sharing rich stories and experiences through maps, or around other topics, really sort of looking at underrepresented groups and their experiences, targeting students from underrepresented communities. We would love the help. That's a part of the challenge, like finding local resources that'll help us get in touch with the schools that really could use the help.
Well, our K-12 education group might be reaching out to you.
Sounds great.
Yeah, just another note on that. Last year's high school winner was about the Green Book in New York City, it was a really good story map that they put together.
I believe I saw that. We might also be featuring it in the Racial Equity Hub.
Well,
go ahead. I was going to say, those stories that provide historical context are really important for equity work. Like, all of it sort of begins with what happened in the past. Let's look at that.
Well, we do have a few more minutes. If folks have questions, put them in the Q&A box and look at them. All right, we got another one. In the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr.'s message, are you aware of anyone that has mapped opportunities for people to engage in acts of service?
I am not, but I will now be on the hunt for that. That sounds great, actually. There is something sort of out about the way that we kind of celebrate Martin Luther King Day these days, is where communities are cleaning up their community. That's good. But it would be great to see how we can crowdsource energy for, acts of service that are maybe about continuing movements for civil rights. There's lots of folks who have their civil rights, in jeopardy, and can always use some help to secure and advance their movement. So that could be really powerful. NorthStar Group will host a special interest group conversation at the Esri user conference, and it has done so every year for the past 3 years. The last 2 times that special interest group meeting has been called the Homecoming, as an opportunity for Black folks from across the globe to come together in one space. And we're looking forward to we wanted to take that experience and turn it into something, in person prior to the pandemic. And now we're excited next year to do something that's hybrid, some in-person activities and some virtual activities. One of those things will be the SIG. It's always a SIG, but there's also a whole meta conference around the Esri user conference that we pull off.
Another question here. Are there any thoughts about the new census data coming out and how it may or may not accurately represent communities of color?
I am so eager to get into almost every new census layer that's coming out. Some stuff that I think, people don't understand is that for many years, the census has struggled to make sure that the policies that they follow from the Office of Management and Budget from 1997 are actually followed. And so in 2020, one of the things that changed that was sort of in the guidelines since 1997 was that people could choose every racial group that they agreed that they sort of identify with. The other interesting thing is that those categories that the census has created, they come from, 1997, and our ideas of race and ethnicity have evolved, but they haven't really evolved in the census. But there are some things that they have done to make sure that the ways in which people are representing that data is at least adhering to those standards. And those standards are good in some ways if you think about the race categories that they've defined as just their own social political categories as they define them as social political constructs, and just sort of finding where you fit in them and being nuanced about where you find your origins in the long form. So we're excited to see that data. So instead of always only really being able to share the folks who identify as Black alone, to be able to say Black people, regardless of whatever other racial identity they chose, white people, regardless of whatever other racial identity they chose. And I think some of that data that already came out is exciting, and we're working behind the scenes to sort of tweak, what's coming next. I don't want to talk about which categories are coming next because something could shift and then they would be mad at me.
All right, we got another one here. How well is the undergrad system or undergrad educational system in the U.S. doing in regards to encouraging GIS studies among people of color?
Yeah, when we think of system, the educational system, I want us to be thoughtful about how we broaden the educational system beyond just the schools themselves, but also think about our organizations like Esri as a company or the consortium as a nonprofit, and where we invest time and support, especially in light of historic harms that are done, right? So I think Esri and other organizations are trying to do better in terms of where they are, providing resources, but broadly, the people from underrepresented racial groups in those schools are struggling in ways that they don't necessarily see, right? There are some historically Black colleges and universities and some predominantly Black institutions that provide GIS and geography education and are great spaces for mentorship for folks from those communities. On the other hand, there are Hispanic serving institutions and these other institutions that get the marker of a minority serving institution that may still be predominantly white spaces that aren't necessarily on a racial justice journey that's creating more belonging and equity for students. So folks may be finding themselves, whether in a predominantly white institution or a predominantly white institution that maybe has a minority serving institution label, and not getting that sort of nurturing that they could need, that they could use, that support that they could use. So think about that system more broadly as also including us and our ability to invest and encourage our organizations to invest more time and resources for a social gain that may result in some kind of an economic gain many years from now. To decide today what the future of GIS and geography looks like. Every bit of investment that we make today in schools is shaping and forming what that future looks like, and every bit of investment that we don't make as well.